Hello, my name is John Bearden. I'm part of the relational mission team, one of the elders in Wellspring Family Church in Dereham. And in this series, I've been looking at some of the foundational emphases and doctrines and practices for us in churches as we're considering laying the foundations for new churches. What are some of the really vital things, what we might call apostolic foundations, that we need to look at? In this session, I want to look at a phrase that we quite often use in our network, which is everyone a witness. In other words, the commitment that we have for every person who's part of one of the churches in relational mission to be caught up in the mission that God has for his church, proclaiming the good news. We often call that evangelism. Now, there are two words, at least in the English language, that we quite often use to describe our mission. One of those words is to witness, and the other word is to evangelize. And those two words are pretty similar in meaning. And so the idea at the bottom line is pretty basic. It's this: we have experienced in finding out about Jesus Christ, we have found out and experienced the most amazing news in the whole universe. And now we have been given responsibility as witnesses of this good news to spread it everywhere. And not only that, but that God has told us that we have an authority, an authorization, if you like, to be ambassadors or messengers to announce it in everywhere. That's why I moved to the town of Dereham to start a church where we would be able to witness to our community and to tell them the good news of what Jesus has done. And in every place where we're working, whichever nation it is, this really is at the very bottom line of our very reason for existing. It's what we're all about. We have experienced God's amazing good news in the person of Jesus Christ, and we as witnesses want to tell everyone about it. Now, this message is so powerful and life-changing that, in fact, as we tell people the good news, that news itself actually has the power to change lives, so that as people are told about it, the message proves the fact that it is true and real by the very change that it brings into people's lives. And the more that we share it and spread it and tell it and witness to it, then the more God's glory is manifest and spread in the earth, which of course we know is God's plan, purpose and intention. Also, it's just worth saying at this point that we realise that we are in a spiritual conflict, and that we will encounter personalities, people who absolutely hate God's good news, irrationally so. And they may, because of their hatred for the message, allow that hatred to spill over in hatred for those who are the messengers, the carriers of the message. And yet, even so, we have discovered that this good news is so good that overcomes, it is more than enough reason to overcome the opposition that we might face in sharing it. So what I want to do in this session is just to take a few minutes to look into the background to why then we witness, why do we evangelize, and mixed in with that a few thoughts around the how that we do it by. But this is not so much a practical message as more looking at the reason behind why. So the first point that I want to make is this, is that there is a big picture, and that you and I, we together are part of God's amazing plan. I'm going to look at a few different verses. The first verses come from Hebrews chapter 1. It says, "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power." So Hebrews 1, verses 1 to 3. So what the writer to Hebrews says is this: God speaks, and that speaking forth turns out to be the person of Jesus Christ. So God doesn't just speak, he personifies that speech. He incarnates it in God the Son. And we see that God has spoken through his Son, and he describes him as a radiance. There is something in the very nature of who God is that radiates out. If you imagine like a fire that's lit, or a torch that's switched on, or a lamp, or a match that's struck, there is something about the very nature of that fire, light, lamp, torch, which is to send out something which becomes known, something that becomes experienced. So God, in his very nature, is a God who radiates, a God who reveals, a God who speaks, a God who makes known. It's the nature of God. And hence, Jesus, the Word, is a communication, and he actually is God. Next, we find that not only is there this radiance coming out from the dynamic and the life of the Trinity, but secondly, what we find is that in the very creation of the universe, that God puts within that creation, right at the start, a command that the news of all this has got to spread. There is a filling to fill the earth with. We could look at this in Genesis 1:28, where Adam is told to fill the earth. And then after the flood, that same instruction is repeated, re-emphasized by Noah in chapter 9, verse 1 and verse 7. And so there is this command to fill the earth. So God is a God who speaks forth, sends out, radiates out. He creates, and he creates and puts into humanity a responsibility to go out, to go forth, and to fill. It's the same expression, the nature and the purpose of God. As we read through the book of Genesis, there are those early chapters, and then in chapter 12, Genesis kind of splits into two halves. In chapter 12, we then begin the story of Abraham. He's been referred to just at the end of chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, God speaks to Abraham in verses 1 to 3. And again, these verses so foundational for understanding exactly God's plan and purpose in all the earth, God's plan and purpose for his people. Verse 1, now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God announces right at the beginning of his dealings with Abraham and what will eventually become the people of Israel, that his intention is that there will be a blessing for all the nations on earth. And somehow it's going to come through Abraham's name, something about his reputation. There's going to be a message, a report brought about something that's coming forth from Abraham and his people, something in Abraham and his people. And we as Christians, we carry within us, there's to be something in us which carries this report, this name, this reputation that brings the very blessing of God to people. As they say, what is the church? Who are these people? What is this message? And when they then see us, they begin to see the message, the good news, gospel message, in some way embodied within the church. So, in the nature of who God is, there's a sending forth. In the very intent of God's creation, there is a going forth mandate given to humanity. Then in God's dealing with Abraham, there is a message, that something that he's going to carry in him and in his descendants, that is going to carry that message, that report, for all the nations to be blessed. As we then go through the scriptures, We've obviously been looking here a bit at Genesis, but as we go through the scriptures, and particularly into some of the prophetic books, then what we begin to find is that there is this mandate that is being reiterated again. And so if we go to Acts 13 and verse 47, we see how, for example, the prophet Isaiah is quoted to explain the mission of the church. Acts 13 and verse 47, and it says, "For so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." It's a quote from Isaiah 49:6. Did you notice that? How the people of God are made as a light, a radiating out, a radiance, like God, and then Christ is a light radiating out. Now the people of God, in their filling of the earth, are to fill it with light, with the knowledge of God. And as Isaiah understands it, they're going to bring salvation. This light, this message, this report, this blessing, this good news is going to take the form of salvation. Indeed, in Isaiah 52, verses 7 and 8, God says to the world, listen to my servant. The servant is going to bring the good news. Now we can understand the servant as being Israel's identity that she didn't live up to, and yet we can see that in that there is a foreshadowing of a greater servant who will fulfill Israel's intent, which is Christ. But we now, as the people of Jesus, are sent as he was sent. That's what Jesus said. As the Father sent me, so now I'm sending you. So we are sent. God in Isaiah speaks to the world and says, listen to my people. They're going to bring, they're going to radiate, they're going to fill, they're going to communicate, they're going to embody a message of good news. This is God's great plan. So in the Old Testament, we see it's in the nature of God, it's in his revealed purpose in creation, it's the promise that's made to Abraham, it's the prophetic mandate given to his people. And then when we come to the start of the New Testament and then the coming of Christ, in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, for example, we see in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so we find here, right at the very beginning of the New Testament, right at the start of the Gospels, that Jesus is the good news. He is the radiance. He is the light. He is the word. He is the message. He's the communication. He is the radiance. He is Emmanuel, as it says in Matthew 1:23. He is God who has now come to save. He embodies that salvation in himself. And now it is his intention that his people should also embody it. This is God's incredible, awesome plan and purpose revealed from Genesis to Revelation. About 84 years ago or so, there was a man called Albert McMakin. Now, Albert McMakin heard that he's American, and he heard that there was a gospel preaching campaign coming to a town nearby to where he was. And he was determined to take as many of the people that lived around him to come and hear the message of the gospel preached. And so he went around and he spoke with lots of the young men, and they said, yeah, we'll go. And then there was one young guy there who he really wanted to be part of it, but this guy was hard, never interested in Christian things, just a difficult person to persuade. But Albert McMakin had an idea. I know what, I'm going to ask this young guy to be the driver. Wow, what a treat. He's going to drive the truck. And so Albert gave him the car, the keys to the truck, and they drove in to hear the speaker speak. And you probably won't be surprised to learn how the story ends, that the young man was now captivated by the message that he heard for the first time. And in due course, he gave his life to Christ. Now, the amazing thing about the story is, and it's possible that you know this already, but the young guy who drove that truck, the guy who was hard, didn't want to hear, didn't want to know, was a guy called Billy Graham. And in his lifetime, Billy Graham has probably preached the gospel worldwide to more people than any other human being who's ever lived in history. Now, there's a very obvious kind of lesson to learn from this. Albert McMakin didn't really preach the gospel to anybody. He simply was instrumental in bringing some people to hear it. We can't all be like Billy Graham. There'll probably be few of us who will be able to stand up and preach in an auditorium. But all of us can be Albert McMakins, people who so embody the message that we capture and carry people's hearts and carry them along so that they can have the opportunity to hear it too. Friends, we've been called to play a part in God's big plan, God's big purpose, God's amazing plan. We are joining in with God's eternal plan. And when we read in Revelation chapter 7, we see how the plan works out. It's utterly glorious. So, I've got 3 points, and that was my first point, the longest point probably, which is to say this, that God has got an awesome big picture which he is calling us to be privileged to be a part of. If you want to be part of what God is doing, this is what he's doing. The second point I want to make is this. The good news contains within it the calling. I'm not going to read it now, but you might like to take a look at Romans chapter 10 and verses 9 to 17. I don't know if you've watched the films, the Mission Impossible series, but you'll probably remember how in the Mission Impossible films, the kind of like the clever idea that they have is that at the start of the film, sometimes it's repeated again later on in the film, the agent receives this communique in some device, and at the end of it, it says, your mission, should you choose to accept it, and then this message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. And of course, the whole point of the film is that the missions are always so exciting that no one's ever going to say, nah, can't be bothered, don't fancy that. And then, of course, the story goes on with Mission Impossible, and all the rest of it. Now, there is a principle about news. The principle is this, is that all news demands telling. And that when news is told, it impacts the hearers in the telling. For example, when a baby is born, that is news. We've recently had a birth in my country. A member of the royal family has been born. It's on the front page of the newspapers. It's news. And there's something about this being an event, it's news. It requires being told. But also you find that news has a tendency to impact the hearers. So good news tends to bring joy. You might hear news of the untimely death of someone, or someone losing their job, or having a tragedy. When you hear the news, you feel sad, you feel happy. You might feel despair. It might be political news, and that makes you feel like giving up hope. You might hear news that provokes you to hope when you think, it looks like this is going to work out after all. It can rouse you to action. It can make you want to run away. The point is this, news demands telling. News always has an impact on the hearers. Now, the ultimate example of this is the good news, the gospel. The gospel utterly demands telling. When you hear it, it's the best news in all the earth. Salvation for humanity. God wins. God has come to his people. He's got a message for it. It's the best news in all the earth. How can you not tell anyone? But not only that, the good news has the power to change lives. So when you hear the good news of salvation, as you hear it, you believe it, you receive salvation in the process. So going back to those verses in Romans 10, we find, for example, that when we hear the good news, faith comes. It says that in verse 17. People sometimes say, well, I wish I could have faith like you. You can. Listen to what it says in the Bible. We hear God's message. Faith comes when we say, I'm going to believe what God says. I'm going to believe the good news. There's no good trying to make people feel faith. It's not they need to hear the news. The news demands telling. The news is the news that has the power to produce faith for salvation. That's what verse 17 of Romans 10 is telling us. The news saves us by hearing it, by believing it, and speaking out. Verses 9 to 11 and 13. When you hear the news, you say, wow, that is good news. Yeah, I believe it. It's really happened. I'm going to be saved by hearing this news. This is such amazing news. So we hear it and faith comes. We hear it and believe it and confess it, and we're saved. There's another curious thing about it. This is in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 9. I'll just turn to that. 2 Timothy 1 verse 9. He says this, speaking of God and Jesus, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. So when you became a Christian, when you heard the good news, you believed it, you were saved by it, at that very time you receive a calling. And that calling has got something to do with God's eternal plan and purpose, which was what my first point was a bit further on in 2 Timothy 4 verse 2. What is the calling? Verse 2. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort. Verse 5. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So the calling that we receive comes to us when we're saved. The good news requires telling. We are commissioned by hearing and believing it to tell other people. We don't need a sign written in the sky. We don't need some other person to tell us. The moment we become a follower of Christ, we hear the good news and believe it and are saved by believing it. We now join those who have a responsibility to pass the good news on. If ever you wonder what is your calling, well, your calling is to become more like Christ, and your calling is to tell people the good news that they can become more like Christ. So the calling on us, Romans 10 verse 15, is that we are to spread it. We need to tell everyone. Isaiah 52 verses 7 and 8 compares us as God's people to being like watchmen. In other words, we're standing up on the parapet on the top of the castle. Maybe there's a castle near you. Imagine you're right up the top, you're on guard duty, you're walking around and you're watching, you're looking to see. What do you do when you see the enemy approaching? You shout, you ring the bell. What do you do if you're waiting for your master to come with his army? When he comes, you shout the good news. The master's coming back. Quick, everyone, wake up, get ready, get the food on, all the rest of it. We're watchmen, watching out for the good news. So my first point then is that this is God's big plan, big purpose, big picture. We're a part of it. Second point, the good news contains our calling within it. It calls us to salvation and it gives us a calling to tell other people about it. My third point, which is really building on this, is that we are God's heralds. It is our prophetic identity to be his witnesses. Let me just read to you a very familiar verse, Acts 1:8. Often refer back to this. It's Jesus speaking to his followers. He says this: but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So this is our identity, to be witnesses in all the earth. Do you remember when Jesus saw the fishermen and he called them? He said, come follow me. And immediately, Matthew 4:19, he said, I'll make you fishers of men. We're called to be witnesses. We're filled to be witnesses. We're called to be fishers of men. Then at the end of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 28, 18 to 20, we read about the Great Commission, our calling to make disciples in all the nations. It's repeated as well at Luke 24, 46 to 48. So this is our calling. And let me just make one or two comments on the manner which we should take up, or the behaviour, the attitude that we should develop as we seek to put this into practice. 1 Peter 3 verse 15 gives us some really helpful guidance on the how of putting this all into practice. Peter writes this: "In your hearts honour Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defence to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience." So the manner with which we are to be witnesses is that we are to do it there with gentleness and with respect. So we are to give a reason for our hope, but to do it in such a way that we are gentle in our treatment of people, not harsh, respectful, so we don't feel so they don't feel that we're crushing them, but rather they feel that they are loved by us. Matthew 5:16 also calls us to take up this manner of meekness and humility in the manner that we communicate. Let's just think of a very few practical ways that we might go about this mission. First thing is this: let's not immediately go over the heads of our own children and grandchildren. 2 Timothy 1:5 kind of illustrates this point, but we have a responsibility to make sure that our children or our grandchildren, our nephews and our nieces, that they hear the good news explained to them so that they can hear it and believe it and receive it and be saved. But as well as reaching those who are close to us, we're commanded to preach it everywhere we go and everyone that we meet. A few verses: Mark 16:15, telling us to preach it to all creation. Acts 8:4, Acts 11:19 to 20, illustrating how as they went, they began to explain the gospel message to the people that they saw. As we've seen, Peter says, be ready, be ready. I wonder if you are ready to be able to give a reason. I'd love to recommend a book to you that I think is so helpful in preparing to give a reason to people. It's by someone called Tim Keller. You've probably heard of him. And the book is called A Reason for God. So I really recommend that to you. Jesus also gave us some practical instructions in this. In Luke 10, verse 6 and 7, he tells us to look for what he calls a man of peace and then to remain with that person. In other words, we may find, if you like, that there are certain individuals who don't want to know, don't want to hear, and that's fair enough. We're gentle, we're respectful, we move on. But then we will find a man, a woman, a household who want to know more. When we find that person, now is time to pause and to share the good news and to explain it thoroughly and carefully and to take time with them and not to rush on too quickly to the next person. This is about making disciples, not simply trying to get someone to pray a prayer and then us dashing on. For example, in Acts 18 verse 4 or Acts 19:8, we find how the Apostle Paul would use patient persuasion, gentleness, respect, patience, taking time. We may find there are people who they're not yet persuaded. They need time to talk it out, to think it through, to weigh it up. But as well as looking for that, the person of peace, as well as patient persuasion, let's also pray for signs and wonders. Mark 16 to 18. Let's pray that there'll be opportunity to pray for people who are sick or suffering, facing all kinds of difficulties, so we can share the good news with them as well, opening their hearts up perhaps as they see God's power at work. So, briefly, just to sum up then, why are we called to be everyone a witness? Why is this so foundational? 3 reasons. First of all, it's God's awesome plan. It's the big story, it's the big picture, and God has called us to be a part of it. Secondly, it's the very DNA of the good news. We are called to spread the good news widely in all the earth. in the very DNA of the good news, we are to be those who share it and preach it and spread it. And thirdly, when we believed, we were called. Friends, you and I, wherever we are, wherever God's taking you to, whether you're in an existing church or part of a church planting group, we have a calling, every one of us, to preach the gospel, to share the gospel, to witness and to tell the good news of what we've witnessed, to explain it patiently, gently, and with respect. I hope that's been helpful to you. You might like to just take some time now, if you're in a group setting, maybe to just pray in a pair and to ask God's Spirit to empower you afresh for this calling of witness. Maybe you might like to share some specific people that are on your heart at the moment and ask God to help you to speak with them. Oh, God bless you. Amen.